The slap echoed off marble walls like a gunshot. 1 second, Officer Dale Pruitt had his hand raised. The next, the woman in navy scrubs was standing perfectly still, blood tracing a thin line from the corner of her mouth, eyes fixed on him, with the kind of absolute calm that doesn't come from yoga classes or meditation apps. It comes from places most people never have to go. Pruitt laughed. He actually laughed. Then the courtroom doors behind him swung open, and Deputy Marshal Yolanda Ferris took one look at the scene, went the color of old ash, and whispered 4 words that would end Grant Pruitt's career: his pension and his freedom before the week was out. Sir, that's the judge. If you're new here, hit subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning that destroyed Dale Pruitt's life began as most disasters do, with a small and stupid assumption. Hartwell County Courthouse sat at the intersection of Brecker Avenue and 5th Street in the mid-sized city of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. Not a glamorous building, not a historic one, just a squat rectangle of gray stone that had been expanded twice and renovated badly both times. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. The fluorescent lighting had a flicker on the 3rd floor that maintenance had been promising to fix since the previous administration. It was the kind of courthouse where serious things happened in deeply unserious surroundings, where felony sentencings occurred down the hall from a vending machine that still sold chips for 75 cents. On a Thursday morning in late October, at approximately 8:47 in the morning, a woman walked through the employee entrance on the south side of the building, carrying a canvas tote bag and wearing navy blue scrubs beneath a plain charcoal gray coat. Her name was Mara Odum. She was 36 years old. She walked the way people walk when they have somewhere to be, and don't particularly feel the need to announce it, not rushing, not dawdling, just moving with the kind of economy of motion that comes from years of operating in places where wasted movement costs you. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no visible badge. She had, as she often did when coming into the courthouse from the medical annex side, clipped her judicial credentials inside her coat rather than letting them dangle outside, because the lanyard had a way of catching on things, and she had already snapped 2 of them this year. This was, as it turned out, the detail that started everything. Mara took the south corridor toward the administrative wing. She passed the clerk's office, the record room, and the narrow junction that split toward courtrooms 7 through 12. She was heading for the chamber's hallway, a restricted section accessible only to staff, law enforcement with clearance, and the court's own judicial officers. She had walked this path 4 days a week for 2 years. She did not make it to the junction. Officer Dale Pruitt was standing at the intersection of the South Corridor and the Maintenance Access Hall, and he was in a bad mood. He had been in a bad mood since 6 that morning, when his sergeant had informed him that his vehicle search from the previous week was being reviewed after a defense attorney raised procedural objections. The review wouldn't go anywhere, it never did, but the paperwork involved was going to eat his weekend. And Pruitt hated paperwork more than he hated most things, which was already a fairly long list. He saw the woman in scrubs come around the corner, and his brain performed the kind of rapid, lazy categorization that it had been trained into over 15 years of patrol work. Scrubs, no visible badge, South Corridor, which was supposed to be restricted. The defendant from Tuesday's assault, hearing a Crana Marsh, mid-30s, dark hair, medium height, had been reported to have tried to access the building through the medical annex twice before her arraignment. Pruitt moved to block Mara's path. Stop right there. Mara stopped. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has encountered this specific kind of problem before and has a system for dealing with it. Officer, she said, ID now. She reached toward her coat. I have credentials. Slowly. His hand moved toward his belt. Keep your hands where I can see them. Mara's hands stilled. She looked at him with a steadiness that most people not trained in trauma assessment, not experienced with individuals in crisis states, would have read as arrogance. Pruitt read it as arrogance. He was wrong about what it was. I work in this building, she said, keeping her voice level. My name is Mara Odum. My credentials are inside my coat. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's acceptable. What are you doing in this corridor? Walking to chambers. This is a restricted hallway, I'm aware. That's why I'm authorized to be here. She held his eyes. If you'll let me show you my credentials, you match the description of a defendant we've been looking for. He stepped closer. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The temperature in Mara's expression dropped about 10 degrees. I am not a defendant. I am an officer of this court. If you will step aside and allow me to show you my identification. Pruitt grabbed her coat at the lapel. It happened fast the way most bad decisions happen, impulsively, with the confidence of someone who has never faced a real consequence for one. He grabbed her coat, swung her around toward the wall, and when Mara turned her body instinctively with the movement rather than against it, a reflex from training so old it lived in her muscles before her mind could weigh in, he read it as resistance, and his palm came up and across her face before he had fully decided to do it. The crack of it bounced off the corridor walls. Mara didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She turned her head slowly back toward him, blood beginning at the corner of her mouth, and looked at Dale Pruitt with an expression that he would later describe, in his deposition, as the most frightening thing he had ever seen on another human being's face. Not rage, not fear, not even contempt. Just a kind of absolute and terrible patience, the look of someone who has already understood exactly how this ends. "You just made a very serious mistake," she said quietly. Pruitt's mouth was open to respond when the courtroom doors at the far end of the corridor swung wide, and Deputy Marshal Yolanda Ferris came through at a half-jog. "Already talking, Your Honor. Judge Kaminsky is pushing the 9 o'clock docket. He's asking if you want to." And then she saw the scene, and her feet stopped as suddenly as if the floor had grabbed them. She looked at Mara. She looked at the blood on Mara's lip. She looked at Pruitt's hand, still raised. And the color drained from her face so completely and so rapidly that Pruitt would later say she looked like a building losing power floor by floor. "Sir," Ferris said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the judge." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Dale Pruitt had been a patrol officer in Hartwell County for 15 years. He had been in tight situations. He had been in situations where his heart rate spiked and his thinking narrowed, and the world reduced itself to the next 5 seconds. He knew what adrenaline felt like, and he knew how to push through it. This was different. This was the specific and particular horror of a man who had just understood, in a single crashing moment, that the ground he thought he was standing on does not exist. She started. "She is Judge Mara Odum," Ferris said, her voice returning with force. "Presiding judge of the Hartwell County Criminal Division. Sir, I need you to step back." Pruitt did not step back. He stood there, hand dropping to his side, and his face went through a rapid and involuntary series of expressions: denial, recalculation, something that might have been the beginning of justification, while Mara touched the blood at the corner of her mouth, examined it briefly on her fingertip, and then reached into her coat and produced a lanyard with a judicial ID card on the end of it and held it in front of Pruitt's face with the same deliberate calm she had been exhibiting since the start of this conversation. Her photo, her name, the seal of the Hartwell County Court of Common Pleas, the words "judicial officer" in clear red text across the top. "I want this hallway cleared," she said, "not to Pruitt, but to Ferris. Get the building supervisor and the duty sergeant down here. Now, yes, Your Honor. And someone get me something for this lip." She walked past Pruitt as if he were a piece of furniture she had decided not to rearrange, and he stood there in the corridor watching her go, and the sound of his own breathing seemed very loud. The duty sergeant was a compact, competent woman named Sergeant Rita Calvo, and she arrived in the South Corridor 4 minutes after Ferris's call with an expression on her face that said she had been briefed and was not pleased. Behind her came Building Supervisor Terrence Oakes, who had the look of a man who was mentally calculating how many forms this was going to generate. Pruitt tried to get in front of the narrative. "She had no visible credentials," he said. "She matched the description of a wanted defendant. I followed standard protocol." "Standard protocol," Calvo repeated. "The defendant, Karina Marsh, she's been trying to access this building. Your Honor has dark hair. She was in the corridor without a visible badge." "Officer Pruitt." Calvo's voice was the kind of quiet that happens just before something gets very loud. "I'm going to need you to stop talking." Pruitt stopped talking. Down the hall, Mara sat in a chair someone had brought out from the clerk's office, pressing a cold compress against the side of her face, her coat folded on her lap, talking to Ferris and another court officer, the no-nonsense efficiency of someone running through a checklist. Her judicial robe, which she had not yet put on because she had been making her way from the annex, not from the parking structure, was presumably still hanging in her chambers. She looked, to Pruitt's increasingly desperate eyes, like someone completely in control of a situation that he had created and could not now contain. The building's security system operated on a 16-camera array with continuous recording and 48-hour storage. Pruitt knew this because he had worked with the system before, had understood its coverage in context of building security. What he had not fully considered in the moment was that the South Corridor was among the most comprehensively covered sections of the building, 4 cameras with overlapping fields of view, positioned specifically because restricted access corridors required thorough documentation. He knew this by the time Calvo came back to him, 20 minutes later, with a face like a closed door. "Camera coverage is complete," she said. "The contact is on record. You're going to surrender your badge and weapon to me right now, and then you're going to sit down and wait for the lieutenant." "Sarge, listen, your badge, Officer Pruitt." Lieutenant Marcus Webb arrived from the Dunmore City Police Department's Hartwell station at 10:15, and Pruitt had worked with Webb long enough to know that Webb's particular brand of silence was not a good sign. Webb listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them short. He looked at the footage on Oakes's tablet, which Oakes had helpfully queued up, and his jaw moved once, as if chewing on something unpleasant. "Sit down, Dale," he said, when the footage ended. "I want to be on record that I believe Dale." "Sit down." Pruitt sat. "This is going to internal affairs," Webb said. "Today. You understand that." She wasn't wearing visible credential. "The camera shows her reaching for her coat within 10 seconds of the contact," Webb said flatly. "It shows you disregarding the verbal identification. It shows the physical contact. And it shows the strike." He looked at Pruitt. 15 years, Dale. What were you thinking?" Pruitt had been asking himself the same question for the past hour and a half, and was no closer to an answer that helped him. What he had been thinking in the corridor was that the woman in scrubs was not going to give him any trouble he couldn't handle. What he had been thinking was that the authority in her voice was the kind that needed to be reminded of its place. What he had been thinking was a collection of fast and careless assessments layered on top of each other, each one reinforcing the next, until the structure they built was high enough that stepping back would have felt like admitting something he didn't want to admit. He had been thinking, in other words, that she couldn't be important, because he had looked at her and decided she wasn't. He sat in the duty sergeant's office with his badge in someone else's hand and tried to understand how that had gone so wrong so fast. Mara Odum, 4 rooms away, was on a call with the court administrator and was very specifically not thinking about Dale Pruitt. She had a docket to manage. She had a 9:45 hearing that was already running late. She had the particular calibration of priorities that comes from having spent years in environments where there was always something on fire. And the relevant question was always the same. What's on fire right now that I can actually do something about? And what do I have to set aside until later? This was not, it should be said, indifference. It was experience. There is a difference. She had spent 2.5 years as a Navy Hospital Corpsman, assigned to a forward surgical element, before transferring to a Special Operations Evacuation Unit attached to Task Force Maritime Operations in the Pacific Theater. She had treated sucking chest wounds in the back of moving vehicles and directed junior medics through procedures they had only practiced on mannequins, in conditions that made practice look like a gentle preparation. She had been in situations where the decision she made in the next 30 seconds determined whether someone lived through the next hour. A slap in a courthouse corridor, delivered by a man who mistook her for a defendant, was not pleasant. But it was not the worst thing that had happened to her this decade, or even this year. She had, after leaving military service, earned a law degree from Keswick University on the GI Bill, clerked for 2 years with the state appellate court, practiced for 4 years in civil rights litigation, a choice that certain people in her life had found interestingly consistent with her service background, and that she had found simply logical, and been appointed to the bench at 34, after a period of involvement with the county's Criminal Justice Reform Commission that had made her both visible and controversial in ways she considered appropriate for the work. She did not advertise her military history. This was not strategic concealment. It was simply that she had found that the moment people knew about the service record, they stopped seeing the lawyer or the judge and started seeing a story, and she had never much enjoyed being someone else's story. What was happening today with Pruitt, however, was going to be a story whether she liked it or not. The call with the court administrator covered the immediate procedural questions: how to document the incident, what notifications were required, whether the docket needed to be adjusted. Mara answered each point in turn, made 3 decisions, delegated 2 tasks, and ended the call in 11 minutes. She was applying ice to her face, the initial compress having been replaced with an actual cold pack from the first aid kit, when her clerk, a young man named Davy Ingram, appeared in the doorway, looking like someone who had been trying to decide whether to knock for the past 4 minutes. "The 9:45 is ready when you are, Your Honor. Give them another 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am." Halsey hesitated. "There are people in the building who are talking about what happened." "I assumed there would be." The defendant from the Marsh case, her attorney is in the hall, and she's heard something and wants to know if the hearing will be affected. The hearing will proceed on schedule. Tell Ms. Marsh's attorney the court will be ready for her. Mara adjusted the cold pack. And Davy. Yes? Close the door on your way out. He did. Mara sat alone for approximately 4 minutes, which was what she had decided she could spare. She spent the first of those minutes reviewing the docket notes on her tablet. She spent the second thinking, carefully and without the self-protective edits that she might have applied in conversation, about what it had felt like when Pruitt's hand made contact with her face. Not the pain was minor. She had experienced considerably worse, but the specific quality of the assumption underneath it, the certainty. The way he had reached for her, without any genuine process of assessment, without hesitating, because he had already decided that she was a category of person who could be grabbed and turned and struck, and that the consequences would be manageable. She had encountered that assumption before, not usually expressed physically, but present, layered into interactions in ways she had learned to identify the skeptical tone when she ruled against a well-regarded prosecutor. The defense attorney, who had once addressed her questions to her law clerk instead of to her, the veteran officer who had appeared in her courtroom for a hearing, and spent the first 15 minutes visibly recalibrating his understanding of who was in charge. She spent the third minute thinking about Pruitt's career record, which she had asked Calvo to pull for her. She had not had time to review it fully, but the summary was not encouraging. 14 excessive force complaints over 15 years. 3 findings of procedural violation, 2 departmental reprimands. A pattern of conduct complaints from individuals with a specific demographic profile that made the pattern visible. She spent the 4th minute deciding that she was going to be exactly as calm for the rest of this day as she had been in that corridor, because losing that calm would be the only way Pruitt could take anything else from her. Then she picked up her robe from the chair where Ferris had draped it, stood, and went to work. The 9:45 hearing ran to 11:30, which was not unusual for a complex assault case with 4 witnesses and a disputed timeline. Mara held the courtroom with the particular authority that very specific judges command, not loudness, not theatrics, but the kind of focused efficiency that means every person in the room understands at all times where the proceeding is going and what is expected of them. Attorneys who had appeared before her knew not to try procedural games in her courtroom. It wasn't that she punished them for it, it was that they never seemed to work, and she had a way of looking at the person who had tried that said, clearly and without words, that she had known what they were doing before they did it. She recessed at 11:40 and was halfway to chambers when Calvo fell into step beside her. The Internal Affairs Lieutenant is requesting a statement when you're available, Calvo said. I have a 1:30 conference. I can give them 30 minutes between 12 and 1. I'll set it up. There's also paused. The footage from this morning. The City PD's review board has been notified. And Judge Odum might... Yes, Pruitt has been in the building talking. To his union rep and to 2 other officers he's close with. Mara stopped walking. She turned to face Calvo. What's he saying? That you were in an area you had no reason to be in. That you gave him attitude before he made contact. Calvo's expression was careful and precise. That the strike was defensive in nature. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, he's been saying this to whom? The 2 officers are both from Hartwell Station. Both have worked with him. Both were in the building for a training session this morning. I want their names logged and their presence in this building documented. Not for any action today, just documented. Calvo nodded. Already done. Mara resumed walking. And Sergeant Calvo, Your Honor. What is Pruitt's current status? He's been told to remain on premises pending the IA interview. He's in the patrol room on 3. He is not to have access to the security system archive, the building supervisor's footage archive, or the courthouse network under any circumstances before IA has taken full custody of the recordings. I want that in writing to Oakes within the hour. Calvo's jaw tightened, just slightly, in a way that told Maras and the sergeant had already thought of this, and was glad someone else had said it out loud. Done. It was 1:58 in the afternoon when the first explosion shook the building. Not a massive blast, not the kind of thing that takes out walls and throws debris through windows. More like a deep structural percussion, a compression of air that Mara felt in her chest before she heard it, a concussive wave that made the documents on her desk slide 2 inches toward the edge, followed immediately by the building alarm, and then by the specific and unmistakable sound of something structural failing a groan from below, a cascade that wasn't water. Mara was on her feet before the 3rd alarm tone completed. She had been in the middle of reviewing evidentiary submissions when it hit. Davy Ingram burst through the chamber doors half a second later, looking like he had forgotten how his own legs worked. Something happened in the annex, he managed. Gas main, maybe the medical annex. The lower level. The Hartwell County Courthouse Medical Annex occupied the building's lower south wing and a connected ground floor structure that had been added in the 1990s to provide medical and psychiatric evaluation services for the court. It operated independently from the main building, but shared infrastructure. And Mara understood immediately. Gas infrastructure from the original building systems that had been the subject of maintenance concerns logged with the facilities office as recently as 6 weeks ago. She grabbed her phone and her coat. "Call the desk on 4, she told Ingram without stopping. "Tell them to initiate the emergency protocol and get the upper floors moving toward the north exits. Don't use the elevators. Your Honor, you should go with minus—" "I heard you, Davy. Make the call." She was already moving. The south stairwell opened to a scene of controlled panic, rapidly becoming less controlled. Courthouse staff and visitors were backing away from the lower landing, where smoke was beginning to push through the gap at the base of the annex door, thin, chemical-smelling, the kind that doesn't come from paper burning, but from something mechanical failing. 2 security officers were at the door, one with a radio to his mouth, one trying to get the door open. "How many people were in the annex?" Mara asked the nearer officer. He startled, he hadn't heard her approach, and then straightened. We don't have a count yet. The session rooms were occupied, there was a medical evaluation at 2, and there were— I need a count. Get your supervisor on the radio and get a count from the session roster right now." She looked at the door. "What's the structural status of that entrance?" "We don't know, ma'am." "Your Honor," she said automatically, not unkindly, already scanning the stairwell access points. "Is there another point of entry to the lower annex?" "There's a maintenance access from the east side, but it requires key or code." Kara turned to the second officer. "What's your radio channel?" he told her. She looked at the smoke, estimated its density and spread rate with the part of her brain that had spent 2 years learning exactly what different kinds of smoke meant in a medical context, and made 3 decisions in the time it took the officer to repeat himself. The annex door opened. Not by itself, a man pushed through it from the inside, coughing, one arm hooked around a woman who was leaning heavily against him. Behind them came another person, stumbling, hands covering their face. The smoke that billowed through the open door was darker than what had been seeping through the gap, and Mara could smell the specific undertone beneath the chemical layer that told her there were people still inside who were not moving. She moved through the door before either security officer registered what she was doing. The lower annex was a narrow institutional corridor lit by emergency lighting, the overhead fluorescents having failed or been cut. 3 session rooms on the left, the medical evaluation suite at the far end, a storage room and janitorial closet on the right. Smoke was densest near the far end, which meant the source was there, and which also meant anyone in the evaluation suite was between Mara and the worst of it. She dropped her coat, held her elbow across her face, and moved fast. A woman was on the floor outside the second session room, conscious, disoriented, trying to get up and finding that her legs were not cooperating in the way she expected. Mara crouched beside her, did a 4-second assessment by touch and observation, and identified a probable CO component to the smoke. The woman's skin was flushed in a specific pattern, her movements uncoordinated in a specific way. "Can you hear me?" Mara said. "I can, yes. I need you to stay low and move toward the door behind me. Don't try to stand. Crawl if you need to. The air is cleaner at ground level. Officers are outside that door. They'll get you." She made sure the woman's eyes were tracking correctly. "Nod if you understand." The woman nodded. Mara moved forward. The session rooms were empty. Their occupants had apparently gotten out. The medical evaluation suite's door was closed, and there was a specific and alarming absence of sound from behind it that Mara did not like. She tried the handle, found it unlocked, and opened it. 3 people inside. One of them was a court officer. She recognized a veteran officer named Carl Steen, who was on his knees beside a civilian she did not recognize, a man in his 40s in a button-down shirt, who was unconscious on the floor. Carl was pressing his hand to the man's chest and looking at Mara with the expression of a man who has reached the outer edge of what he knows how to do and understands it. "He went down about 3 minutes ago," Carl said. "I checked for a pulse, it's there, but I don't." "Get low," Mara said, moving across the room. "Stay below the smoke layer." She was on her knees beside the man in the next second, assessing. Airway compromised but not blocked. Breathing shallow, rate elevated. Pulse present, irregular in the specific way that meant cardiac muscle stress from hypoxia, not arrhythmia, not yet. The man's fingernails were bluish at the beds. His lips had the grayish tinge of significant oxygen debt. She looked up at Carl. Did this room have a vent running when you came in? The climate unit? Yes, it was on. The climate unit? Running on the shared duct system that ran through the compromised section of the annex. Recycled air from the source of the gas event pumped directly into a sealed room with 3 people in it. Get the vent shut off, she said. The control panel is on the wall by the door. The red manual cut off. Carl moved. Mara positioned herself and began the process of moving the unconscious man toward the door, working with the pragmatic physicality she had developed in years of moving people who couldn't move themselves, angling her body, using mechanical advantage, keeping his airway in the right position, while she got him toward cleaner air, toward the corridor, toward the door that she had propped open. It took 4 minutes. It felt like considerably more. She got him into the corridor as 2 EMTs arrived through the maintenance access door from the east side, and she stood and pointed and told them in 3 sentences exactly what she had observed about the man's presentation, his timeline of exposure, and the vent contamination, speaking the way she had learned to speak when time is short and accuracy is everything, no wasted words, no softening. The EMTs took over. Mara stood in the annex corridor, smoke thinning around her as the ventilation began to clear, and noticed for the first time that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the particular aftermath of focused emergency action, when the body has been running on compressed attention and the release is physical and involuntary. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Carl Steen was beside her. He looked at her the way people look at someone when they are recalibrating something they thought they knew. Your Honor, he said, and then seemed to not know what should follow that. Get outside, she said. Get some air, ma'am. How did you know about the vent? Mara looked at him. Medical training, she said. Then she walked back through the door toward the stairwell, where the evacuation was still in progress and there was still work to be done. She did not see Dale Pruitt watching from the top of the stairwell, where he had stationed himself in the aftermath of the explosion, a man looking for any narrative he could attach himself to that wasn't the one playing out in the IA conference room down the hall. She did not see him, but he saw her, and what he saw made him deeply, specifically afraid. Pruitt didn't move from the top of the stairwell for a long time after Mara disappeared around the corner below. The evacuation noise was still going, radios, voices, the controlled urgency of emergency personnel finding their rhythm, and none of it registered to him the way it should have. What registered was the image of the woman he had struck that morning moving through a smoke-filled corridor with the specific confidence of someone who had done exactly this kind of thing before, in conditions he could not imagine and would not have survived, treating a collapsed man while CO was still in the air, giving instructions to EMTs who were listening to her the way you listen to someone whose knowledge is not theoretical. He had called her a defendant. He had grabbed her coat and slapped her face and called her a defendant. Pruitt pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and understood, in the particular and devastating way that a man understands something he cannot unknow, that there was no version of the next 48 hours that ended well for him. His union rep, a humorless attorney named Swick, had told him during their brief conference to say nothing, do nothing, make no contact. Standard guidance, the kind that exists because it is correct and because officers who ignore it tend to make everything worse. Pruitt had nodded and agreed, and then spent the next 2 hours in the patrol room doing exactly the kind of thinking that Swick's guidance was designed to prevent. He had talked to Donnie Farwell and Kel Obrist, 2 officers from Hartwell Station, who had been in the building for a training rotation. He had told them his version of the morning, not quite fabricated, but arranged, selectively ordered in a way that foregrounded his perception of threat and backgrounded the 11 seconds between Mara's verbal identification and the physical contact. He had, in the specific language that 15 years of departmental self-preservation had built into his vocabulary, characterized the strike as a reactive response to perceived resistance. Donnie had nodded. Kel had made the right noises. Neither of them had said anything that helped. What none of them had known, while Pruitt was talking, was that Sergeant Calvo had already logged their names and their presence in the building, exactly as Mara had instructed, and that the building's security system had captured all 3 of them in the patrol room corridor at the time of their conversation. Pruitt did not know this yet. He would. The external response to the annex explosion arrived in stages, the way it does in real emergencies rather than the way it does in the movies, not all at once with coordinated precision, but incrementally. each layer slightly behind the one it was supposed to reinforce. The Dunmore Fire Department reached the building at 14 minutes past the initial alarm. 2 ambulances were staged in the east lot by the time Mara emerged from the annex, and a third arrived 4 minutes later. The gas utility company sent an emergency crew who were still an hour out. The incident commander, a calm and methodical fire captain named Dorset, set up operations in the courthouse lobby and began working through the systematic process of accounting for everyone who had been in or near the annex at the time of the explosion. It was not a fast process. The annex had housed, at the time of the event, 11 people, 3 medical evaluation staff, 2 court officers, 4 people either waiting for or undergoing court-ordered evaluations, and 1 attorney who had arrived early for a 2:30 session and been shown to a waiting area while her client was in the back. Of the 11, 9 had gotten out under their own power, helped in varying degrees by each other. 1, the attorney, had been found by first responders near the east maintenance door, disoriented but ambulatory. 1, the man in the button-down shirt, whose name turned out to be Victor Solano, a 44-year-old civil engineer who had been required to attend a court-mandated anger management evaluation, was en route to Dunmore General by the time Captain Dorset had his full count. The EMT who had taken Mara's handoff on Solano later told his supervisor, in a matter-of-fact way that contained genuine admiration, that the quality of the information he had received from the woman in scrubs was the kind you got from emergency medicine professionals, not from bystanders. Specific, organized, prioritized. He hadn't had to ask a single follow-up question. His supervisor asked who the woman was. The EMT said he hadn't caught a name. Someone in the building told him she was a judge. His supervisor took a moment with that and then moved on to other things. Mara had changed into the spare set of clothes she kept in her chambers, a pragmatic habit from years when she moved between environments where what she was wearing at the start of the day was rarely appropriate for what the day became and was. Sitting across from an internal affairs investigator named Garland when Carl Steen knocked and opened the door without waiting, which was unusual enough that both Mara and Garland looked up. "Sorry to interrupt," Carl said, and didn't look particularly sorry. "Your Honor, there's something you need to know. Pruitt, he's been asking about the archive." Mara's expression didn't change. "Asking who? Terry Oaks? Facilities. He came down to Oaks's office about 20 minutes ago, asking about whether the security system had backed up to the external server yet, and whether there was a way to pull a specific time segment before the backup completed." Garland had his pen out. "Mr. Steen, I'm going to need you to—" "I know," Carl said. "I'll give you a full statement. He looked at Mara. "I wanted you to know first." "Thank you, Carl." Mara turned to Garland. "I assume you'll want to talk to Mr. Oaks as well." "Already on my list," Garland said and wrote something down. Carl left. Mara and Garland looked at each other for a moment with the shared, unspoken understanding of 2 people who have just watched a man's situation get significantly worse. "He's going to claim he was trying to access footage to support his account," Mara said. "Probably." Garland turned his pen in his fingers. "Can I ask you something off the official record?" "You can ask. Did you expect this? This morning, before any of it happened, did you have any reason to anticipate that Pruitt specifically would be a problem?" Mara thought about the question carefully, which was how she thought about most questions. "I didn't know his name before this morning. I've seen his type, the confidence of someone who has never genuinely been held to account." She paused. "That's not prediction. That's pattern recognition." Garland wrote that down too, and Mara noticed he wrote it down, and neither of them commented on it. The internal affairs interview concluded at 4:15. Mara had given a statement that was, by her own standard, technically complete and deliberately measured every relevant fact, in sequence, with minimal editorial framing, because she had been a lawyer long enough to know that the editing is where things go wrong. She described what had happened in the corridor in the same tone she used to read evidentiary summaries aloud, which was not the absence of feeling but the containment of it in service of clarity. Garland was professional. He did not try to minimize what the footage showed, and he did not perform the kind of sympathetic head-tilting that Mara found more irritating than straightforward bureaucratic procedure. He treated her like a witness, which was what she was, and she appreciated the directness. She was reviewing the afternoon's postponed docket when Davy appeared in her doorway at 4:47 with the expression he used when delivering information he had calculated she would want immediately. "The IA office just called. They've expanded the inquiry." Mara looked up. "On what basis?" "They pulled Pruitt's file. Not just the summary, the full file." Davy had a piece of paper in his hand, which he was not looking at. 14 excessive force complaints. He said 3 earlier. His union rep mentioned 3 during the initial deposition. The full file has 14. Morrow was quiet for a moment. Sustained? 2 full findings. 3 partial. The rest closed without action. He hesitated. There are also 2 complaints from defendants who allege that evidence in their cases was inconsistent with the official reports. Both cases were prosecuted. Both defendants were convicted. The room was very quiet. Mara set down the document she had been reviewing and looked at Davy with the same deliberate steadiness she had used in the corridor that morning, the same quality of attention that had nothing performative in it. "Who has the case files?" she said. "The county prosecutor's office has the originals. Aya has requested them." "Good." She picked up her pen. "Go home, Davy. I'll lock up." "You sure?" "I'll lock up," she repeated. He went. Mara sat alone in her chambers for the second time that day and looked at the wall above her desk, where she had put nothing decorative, no awards, no framed degrees, nothing that required someone else's interpretation of what she had earned and what it meant. Just a blank wall, painted the institutional beige of every government office she had ever occupied, and a small framed photograph on the corner of the desk that she did not keep there for display, but for the same reason people keep certain objects in their line of sight when the day gets long, because it reminds them of the thing they already know. The photograph was from her second deployment. 12 people in field gear outside a forward operating post somewhere she could not specify and had no reason to. She was 4th from the left, 23 years old, looking not at the camera but at something to the right of it, with an expression that was neither happy nor unhappy, just present, paying attention. She looked at it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened the next file. Dale Pruitt was suspended without pay at 5:10 that afternoon, formally and in writing, and escorted from the building by Sergeant Calvo and a second officer, while Lieutenant Webb watched from the far end of the hallway with his arms folded. The Union Rep Swick was present, standing near Pruitt's left shoulder, with the resigned body language of someone who has done this walk before, and will do it again, and does not find it dramatically interesting. Pruitt did not make a scene. He had, somewhere between the stairwell and the patrol room and the IA interview, used up whatever reserves of bluster he had available to him, and what remained was a kind of deflated stubbornness, the posture of a man who has not yet accepted the situation, but can no longer argue with it in real time. He said, at the building's south exit, to no one in particular, she was out of place. Anyone would have done the same thing. Calvo said nothing. The second officer said nothing. Swick put a hand briefly on Pruitt's arm and steered him through the door and into the parking lot, where the October air was cold and the sky had gone flat gray and the day was running out. What Pruitt did not know, as he sat in his car in the courthouse lot and looked at the building he had worked beside for 15 years, was that the IA review that had been initiated as a single incident inquiry was within that same hour being reclassified. The 2 evidence inconsistency complaints that Davy had mentioned tomorrow were not, it turned out, the only ones. The county prosecutor's office, responding to the records request, had flagged 3 additional cases in which there were documentation anomalies connected to arrests made by Pruitt. In 2 of those cases, the arresting report had been filed after a custody transfer that the system timestamp recorded differently than Pruitt's paperwork did. In one case, a piece of physical evidence documented in Pruitt's report as collected at scene did not appear in the chain of custody log until 72 hours after the arrest, a gap that had been explained, at the time, by a clerical error that a junior officer named Brant Oleski had signed off on. Brant Oleski had since transferred to a different station. He had been, in the years since, quietly promoted twice. He had also, it emerged in a phone call between his current sergeant and the IA investigator at 6:40 that evening, sent an email to the city's police oversight office 14 months ago that had been received, acknowledged, and filed without action. The email described, in Oleski's direct and somewhat stilted prose, a specific instance in which he had been asked by Pruitt to alter the timestamp on an evidence log. He had declined. He had documented the request and sent it to oversight because he had not known what else to do with it, and he had heard nothing back, and he had concluded the way junior officers often conclude when they send a complaint into the bureaucratic dark and hear only silence, that the conclusion was that he should move on. The email had sat in the oversight office's intake folder for 14 months unopened because the officer assigned to intake had left on medical leave 6 weeks after Oleski's message arrived, and the folder had been reassigned to a general queue that nobody had prioritized. Garland read the email at 7:15 Thursday evening in the IA office, with a second investigator named Prisha Wolt sitting across from him, and they looked at each other in the particular way of people who have found the thing they were looking for and understand that it is much larger than they thought. "Who else has seen this?" Walt asked. "Right now?" "Us." Garland closed the folder. "We need to call the prosecutor." Mara was at home by 8, a townhouse on the north side of Dunmore that she had owned for 6 years and had furnished over time, in the way of someone who keeps moving the furniture until it stops bothering them, which means it still wasn't quite right but was getting closer. She heated something she had made the previous Sunday and ate it standing at the counter because she had not yet developed the habit of sitting at a table alone and probably wouldn't. Her face was still sore. The compress had helped with the swelling, but not with the deeper bruise developing along her cheekbone, and when she caught her reflection in the dark kitchen window, she spent a moment with it, not vanity, just the particular attention of a person taking inventory. She had looked worse after worse things. She would look fine by Monday. She was reading case notes at the table when her phone rang with a number she recognized as the IA division line. "Judge Odum," she said. "It's Garland. I apologize for the hour. I wanted you to hear this from me before it's in the system tomorrow morning." He paused, in the way people pause when they are determining the exact right amount of information to share. "The inquiry has expanded. We have documentation of evidence handling irregularities in at least 3 of Pruitt's previous cases. We have a witness who was asked to alter official records and reported it, and the report was not acted on." Mara was quiet for a moment. "How many cases are we looking at potentially?" "That's what we're going to start determining tomorrow. The prosecutor's office is looping in their review unit." Another pause. "Some of those cases, the individuals convicted, they may be entitled to relief." "Yes," Mara said, "they may be. I wanted you to know." Because Garland seemed to be choosing his words. "Because this morning's incident is no longer just an assault complaint. What you brought into the building today, Your Honor, the way this started it, opened something that might not have opened otherwise." Mara looked at the kitchen window and her own reflection in it, and thought about a man she had never met named Victor Solano, lying on a floor while recycled air compromised his breathing, and a junior officer named Oleski sitting in front of a computer screen 14 months ago and trying to figure out what you did when the system you reported to didn't answer. "Keep me informed," she said, "within the constraints of what's appropriate." "Yes, ma'am." She set down the phone and sat with the kitchen quiet around her. And for the first time since 7 that morning, she let herself be still without a task immediately following. Just still, in her own kitchen, in the particular silence of a situation that was much larger than it had been at 8:47 this morning, when she rounded a corner and a man decided, in the space of a glance, exactly who she was. She was still sitting there when her phone rang again. Different number this time, area code she didn't immediately place. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was a man's, and it was familiar in the way that voices from very specific times in your life are familiar, not comforting necessarily, but immediate. The way a sound associated with a particular period can bypass everything and land directly in the memory of it. Mara, a pause. "It's Sergeant Major Deke Yaris, retired. I'm calling because someone showed me something this afternoon, and I think we need to talk before tomorrow morning." Mara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. She and Yaris had served in the same operational element for 11 months of her second deployment. He had been her senior NCO. He had also been the person who had submitted, without telling her, the formal recommendation that led to her service commendation. A commendation she had not known about until 2 years after her separation from the Navy, when the paperwork arrived at an address that had taken that long to track her down. "What did someone show you?" she said. "A video of this morning. It's been circulating since about 3 o'clock, Mara. The courthouse security cameras aren't the only cameras in that building." He paused. "And the people who've been watching it, some of them, are not the kind of people that Pruitt is going to be comfortable knowing about." The kitchen was very quiet. "What kind of people?" she said. And Yaris told her, and Mara Odum sat very still in her kitchen and understood that the morning, which had already expanded in ways she had not anticipated, was about to expand further in a direction she had not seen coming at all. Deke Yaris was not a man who called people at night to make conversation. Mara had known him for going on 13 years, counting the deployment and the years since, when they had maintained the loose, infrequent contact of people whose bond was situational but genuine, a call at the right moment, a message that arrived when it was needed. He communicated when he had something to communicate, and he stopped when he had said it. In 11 months of working under his command, she had never heard him use 2 sentences when one would do. So when he said, carefully, "Some of them are not the kind of people," Pruitt is going to be comfortable knowing about. She took that seriously. Deke Yaris using the word careful in his tone was the equivalent of anyone else using an air raid siren. Who's watching it? She said. The video started moving through law enforcement channels around 1500 hours. Someone in the courthouse we don't know who recorded on a personal phone during the evacuation sequence after you came out of the annex. You're visible. You're managing the EMT handoff, giving them the rundown on Solano, and then turning around and going back in for a secondary sweep. He paused. That part, the secondary sweep, that's the part that got people's attention. Mara had gone back in because she had counted 11 people in the annex roster and had physically seen 9 of them come out. She had gone back in to account for the remaining 2. This had taken approximately 90 seconds and had resulted in finding the attorney she mentioned, who had been seated on the floor of the women's restroom with her back against the wall and her jacket pressed over her face, methodical and calm and completely uncertain of which direction the exit was. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was a count that didn't balance and a woman who needed a hand. I didn't know anyone was filming, she said. Nobody ever does. The thing is, Yaris stopped, and she could hear him deciding. Earlier today, Captain Verena Dosh from the Naval Reserve Liaison Office in Philadelphia was in a meeting at the Federal Building in Harrisburg. Someone in that meeting showed her the clip. She recognized you. Mara said nothing. She put a call to her CO, made 2 more calls. And by about 1900 hours, there were people at that level who were aware that Mara Odum, who they knew as 3rd Class Petty Officer Odum from the Tanner Creek Evac Unit, who received a service commendation for operations they are not able to discuss publicly, was in a Pennsylvania courthouse this morning, getting slapped by a patrol officer. Deke. Her voice was very level. What are they going to do with that? Nothing without your consent. That's why I'm calling. Verena asked me to reach you first. He seemed to take a breath. They're not looking to insert themselves into a civilian matter. But there are individuals at that level who feel strongly that what happened this morning was documented poorly, that the public record of who you are and what you've done is incomplete in ways that are relevant to how this situation is being perceived. The civilian record is sufficient. They know that. But Mara, and here he shifted, and she could hear it, the specific softening that Yaris permitted himself only when he was saying something he believed the other person needed to hear, whether or not they wanted to. The man who hit you is going to spend the next several weeks arguing that you were in the wrong place without the right credentials and that he made a reasonable assessment of a threat. He has a union. He has colleagues who are already circling the narrative. You are one judge in one county with a bruise on your face and a security tape and a complete evidentiary record, she said. And that, he paused. I'm just telling you that there are people who would like to stand in the room, not to take over, not to make this something it isn't, just to stand there. Mara looked at the table. She looked at the window. She thought about Brant Oleski, sitting in front of a screen 14 months ago, sending a message into silence. Tell Verena Dosh, she said at last, that I appreciate the call, that I will reach out to her directly in the morning. And tell she stopped. Tell her I'm fine. She'll know that, Yaris said. That's sort of the problem. He ended the call. Mara sat with the phone on the table and the kitchen quiet and the half-eaten food getting cold beside her, and thought about what it meant that the people who knew her best, who had seen her in the worst conditions she had ever operated in, were not surprised by anything she had done today, were not calling to check on her, were calling because they were already several steps ahead of her in calculating what came next. It was in a specific way the most unsettling part of the day. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, and Dunmore's morning news cycle arrived with it. The video had moved off law enforcement channels and onto local media by 6:15. Mara knew this because Davy sent her a text at 6:42 that said simply, "Local news has the annex footage. I've forwarded 3 media inquiry calls to the court's public affairs office." She was already dressed and already thinking. The news coverage was, as these things tend to be, only partly accurate. The headline on the Dunmore Register's website read, "Hartwell Judge Assists in Courthouse Emergency Hours After Alleged Officer Assault." The story had the broad shape right officer assault annex explosion. Mara's involvement in the evacuation but had the sequence slightly wrong and had, in the way of local news working fast with partial information, introduced 2 details that were not accurate and 1 description of the annex events that was considerably more dramatic than what had actually occurred. Mara did not call to correct them. That was not her job this morning. Her job this morning was a 9 o'clock juvenile hearing that had been postponed from the previous day, and a pre-trial conference at 11, and a meeting at 1 with the county prosecutor's office that had been arranged the previous evening, and which would not, she understood, be about anything from her docket. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:20. The building's south entrance had 2 local news vans parked at its edge, outside the perimeter, but well within camera range of anyone coming through the employee entrance. Mara went through the parking structure on the building's north side and entered via the administrative access, which required a key card and was not visible from the street. Carl Steen was at the security desk inside and looked visibly relieved when she came through the door. "How's your face?" he said, which was not standard courthouse protocol, but which Mara considered acceptable under the circumstances. "Serviceable," she said. "What's the temperature in the building today?" "Tense," he said. Pruitt's rep filed something with the union at 0700. "I don't know what's in it, but Lieutenant Webb is in early and he doesn't look happy." He paused. There were also 2 phone calls to the court administrator's line, before 8, that came from numbers registered to the Hartwell Patrolmen's Union. The administrator's assistant logged them. What was said? They didn't leave specific messages, just said they wanted to discuss the morning's incident with a court representative. Mara absorbed this. The union calling the court's administrator rather than the police department's legal counsel was an unusual routing, and it was the kind of unusual thing that had a specific purpose. It was positioning, the beginning of an attempt to move the conversation away from evidentiary and institutional grounds, where the footage and the IA record were dispositive toward administrative and interpersonal ones, where language was softer and things could be characterized differently. "Log the calls," she said. "And Carl, thank you for yesterday." He looked mildly uncomfortable, the way people do when they are thanked for things they consider basic. "I didn't do much." "You did the red switch," she said. That mattered. She went to work. The juvenile hearing ran to 10:45. Mara handled it with the specific calibration that juvenile matters required, firmer on process, softer on tone, constantly managing the gap between what the system needed to document and what the human beings in the room needed to actually absorb. The 14-year-old defendant was terrified in the specific way of teenagers who had not until this moment genuinely believed that the thing they had done had real dimensions. His mother was exhausted. His public defender was young and nervous, and twice said things she shouldn't have said, and Mara let both instances pass without comment because they were harmless and because correcting them in front of the client would have done more damage than the errors themselves. She recessed at 10:48 and was in chambers for 12 minutes before Garland called. "We've identified 6 cases," he said, "potentially 7. Pruitt's arrest records going back 9 years. In each one, there's a documentation irregularity, chain of custody, timestamp report sequencing. In 2 cases, the irregularity is significant enough that a competent defense attorney would have had grounds for dismissal." Mara let the silence sit for a moment. "Were those cases prosecuted?" "Both went to conviction. One of the defendants served 18 months. He's out now. The other is currently in the 3rd year of a 4-year sentence." She looked at her desk. "Garland. Yeah. That second one, the person currently serving. Has the prosecutor's office been informed?" "That's happening right now. The review unit is pulling the file. It's going to be a process. Your Honor, it doesn't move fast." "It moves as fast as the people running it decide it needs to move," she said, not unkindly but precisely. "Make sure that's been communicated." "I'll make sure." He paused. "There's one more thing. Oleski, the officer who filed the complaint 14 months ago. He came in voluntarily this morning, first thing. He brought documentation, notes he made at the time, emails, a personal log he's kept since the incident." Another pause. "He's been waiting for someone to actually open the folder for 14 months. Mara was quiet for a moment in a way that had weight in it. "Give him whatever he needs," she said. The pretrial conference at 11 was a complicated narcotics case with 3 defendants and 4 attorneys, and it required Mara's full and undivided attention, which she gave it, because the alternative, allowing her mind to split between the courtroom and the expanding situation outside it, was not something she was willing to do to the people whose cases were in front of her. They had come for a judge. She owed them exactly that. She was aware, in the background, of the building's tension. Court officers exchanging looks, staff members who held eye contact half a second longer than usual as she passed. The specific quality of attention that a building develops when something has happened inside it, and the people inside it are still processing the shape of it. During a brief recess at 12:20, her phone showed a message from a number she had added to her contacts the previous night. "Captain Dosh, Naval Reserve Liaison, Philadelphia." The message read, "Available at your convenience. No pressure on timeline. Yaris sends his regards. Mara replied, "This afternoon if possible. I'll call at 1400. She put the phone away and went back in. The 1 o'clock meeting with the county prosecutor's office was held in a conference room on the 4th floor. The kind of institutional space that exists in every government building, a table that was too big for comfortable conversation, chairs with armrests that didn't quite align, a whiteboard with residual marker that hadn't fully erased. District Attorney Petra Ingold was already there when Mara arrived, along with 2 members of Ingold's review team, and a woman Mara didn't know who was introduced as Felicity Crane from the State Attorney General's office. The State Attorney General's office. Mara noted this without visible reaction, sat down, and accepted the cup of bad coffee someone offered her. Ingold got to the point which Mara appreciated. "We have 6 cases with documentable irregularities and 1 case with documentation that may support a wrongful conviction claim. The AG's office has jurisdiction over police misconduct at the state level, which is why Felicity is here. We're coordinating." She looked at Mara. "We want to brief you because you're the sitting judge on 3 of the 6 cases' prior rulings, procedural history, and because," she paused, "because this started with your complaint." "My statement to Mara said. "Not a complaint." "Yes, your statement." Ingold's tone was careful, and Mara respected the carefulness. "I want to be clear that your involvement in this investigation is limited to what's appropriate. You're not a party to the misconduct cases. But your role in what happened yesterday, both in the corridor and in the annex, has drawn attention that is—" She seemed to search for the word. "Accelerating things, I understand." Crane from the AG's office spoke for the first time. She was younger than Mara had expected, mid-30s, precise in her diction, with the specific focus of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was not going to waste the preparation. "Judge Odum, the person currently incarcerated, based on a potentially compromised case. His name is Torrin Peel, 29 years old, convicted on a drug distribution charge 3 years ago. The evidence handling in his case shows a 63-hour gap in chain of custody for the primary physical evidence, explained by a report Pruitt filed that contains 2 internal timestamp inconsistencies. Have you spoken to Peel's attorney? Not yet. We want the file review complete before we make contact. We expect that to be done by tomorrow afternoon." "Make it tomorrow morning," Mara said. Crane looked at her. "The review unit has a process." "I know what the process is," Mara said evenly. "I'm telling you that a 29-year-old is currently in a state correctional facility on evidence that you now have reason to believe may have been falsified, and that every additional day of process time before his legal representative is informed is a day that I would find difficult to justify to a review board. I'm not telling you how to run your investigation. I'm telling you how I think about time in this context." There was a short silence. "Tomorrow morning," Crane said. "I'll make it work." Ingold looked at Mara with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. The meeting ran 90 minutes. By the end of it, the shape of what was coming had clarified into something with real edges: a multi-case misconduct review, a potential wrongful conviction proceeding, a IA investigation that had begun as a single incident inquiry and was now a systematic examination of 9 years of Pruitt's record, and a union challenge that was already generating friction and would generate more. Mara left the conference room at 2:40 and went to her chambers and called Captain Verena Dosch. Dosch was direct in the way that people with operational backgrounds tend to be: direct, not abrupt, but efficient, with the specific economy of someone who manages complex information constantly and has learned to move through it without ornamentation. "I want you to know that nothing we're discussing is about making this bigger than it needs to be," Dosch said. "What Yaris told you last night is accurate. There are people who saw the footage and who have feelings about it." "What kind of feelings?" "The kind that come from knowing what your service record actually contains and watching someone who doesn't know reduce you to a category they invented in 2 seconds. She paused. "There's also a practical dimension. Pruitt's union is going to argue that the circumstances were ambiguous, that you weren't clearly identified, that a reasonable officer in his position— I'm familiar with the argument— would have perceived a threat. The courthouse footage is strong, but it's a single-camera perspective, and defense framing can do work with single-camera footage." Another pause. "Your service record, specifically the commendation documentation from Tanner Creek, contains language about your conduct under operational conditions that is relevant to how a fact-finder understands who they're looking at." Mara was quiet. "I'm not suggesting we put your service record in front of a news camera," Dosch said. "I'm suggesting that when this goes to a formal proceeding, the assault charge, the civil rights elements there, may be value in the fact-finder having access to the full picture of your background. Not as theater, as evidence. That would require my consent and a formal process, Mara said. Yes, it would. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because Yaris asked me to make contact, and because I thought you should hear it from a person rather than a document. Mara thought about it for a moment that was longer than her usual processing time, because this particular question had more dimensions than most. There was the question of what she wanted, which was not the primary question. There was the question of what was useful to the proceeding, and to the people Oleski Peel, the unnamed others, whose cases were now being reopened, whose situations the proceeding was actually about. There was the question of what it meant to allow the record to speak, when the record had been kept quiet for reasons that were hers, and that she had maintained deliberately. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. Captain Dosh. Mara looked at the photograph on her desk. When you saw the footage, the annex footage, what did you think? A pause, I thought, there she is. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll call you tomorrow. It was 3:15 when Davy knocked and opened the door with the urgency that by now Mara had learned to read as distinct from his normal knock. There's a situation in the building, he said. Pruitt is here. Mara looked up. He was escorted out yesterday. His union rep brought him back in for a meeting with Webb and the department's legal counsel. They're on 3. Davy stopped. He's been in the hallway. Carl saw him near the records request desk 10 minutes ago. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. Where was he supposed to be? Conference room 3C. The meeting started 20 minutes ago. He paused. Carl says he was near the records desk for at least 5 minutes before someone noticed and brought him back. Mara was already picking up the phone. Get Garland. Now. And get me Carl Steen. Carl arrived first. He came in with the specific contained urgency of someone who had been running and had slowed down for the door. What was he doing at the records desk, she said. I don't know. He wasn't requesting anything not officially. He was talking to Arlene Muir, the clerk's assistant. She didn't know he'd been suspended. Carl's jaw was tight. By the time I got there, he was already moving back toward the elevator. What does Arlene's station cover? Carl paused. The case file request logs and the evidence reference requests. Cross-referenced with the court's case management system. Mara looked at him. He looked at her. The same understanding arriving at the same time. The case file request logs were not themselves evidence, but they showed what files had been accessed, when, and by whom, and if someone had been searching specific case numbers in the last 12 hours. That search history existed in the system, and if someone wanted to know which cases were being pulled for the IA review before the review was formally announced. Her phone rang. Garland. He accessed the system, Garland said before she could speak. His voice had the quality of someone delivering news that has already made them angry. We just found it. Pruitt logged into the courthouse case management portal at 0640 this morning from a remote access point. His credentials weren't flagged because the suspension was entered into the HR system, but the IT access revocation runs on a different processing cycle. It updates overnight. What did he access? The case file numbers that match 4 of the 6 cases under review. He ran searches on all 4 between 0640 and 0715, a pause. And then he came into the building at 1400 for a meeting that was scheduled for 1430. He was at the records desk between 1420 and 1425. Mara sat with this for precisely 3 seconds. Garland. I need you to call Wolt, and I need you to call Crane at the AG's office. Not sequentially. At the same time, she stood up. And I need a hold placed on the system access log, the full log. From 2200 last night to right now before anyone else touches it. Already on the hold. The other calls. Now, Garland. She ended the call and looked at Davy. Where is Webb right now? Conference room 3C. Take me there. Conference room 3C was a small space near the department liaison offices, functional and spare, with a table that seated 6 and currently had 4 people at it. Lieutenant Webb, a department legal counsel named Farquhar, who Mara knew by reputation, Union Rep Swick, and Dale Pruitt, who was in street clothes and who looked. When the door opened and Mara walked in with Davy behind her, like a man who has just heard a sound he can't place and knows it's not good. Webb stood up immediately. Your Honor, this meeting is a private. Officer Pruitt accessed the courthouse case management system at 6:40 this morning from a remote location, Mara said. He searched the file numbers for 4 cases currently under active IA review. He then entered this building 2 hours ago, during a meeting that did not begin for another 30 minutes, and was observed near the records request desk for a minimum of 5 minutes. She looked directly at Pruitt. The system access log and the building entry log are both being preserved as of this moment. The room was very quiet. Swick's expression had done something complicated and was now doing nothing at all, which was a trained response and which told Mara he had not known about the morning system access. Farquhar said, carefully, Judge Odum, if you're alleging. I'm not alleging anything, Mara said. I'm informing Lieutenant Webb of facts that are now part of an active investigation. What anyone does with those facts is not my determination to make. She looked at Webb. This conversation should involve the AG's office. I'd suggest you call them. She walked out. In the hallway, she pressed her back briefly against the wall and took 2 full breaths, not from fear, not from anger, but from the physiological reality that she had been running on compressed focus since 8:47 yesterday morning, and her body was making a specific kind of demand on her attention that she could not much longer defer. Her face ached. She was tired in the deep tissue way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with sustained vigilance. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the stairwell. She was 3 steps from the stairwell door when her phone vibrated with a message from Dosh. Movement here. Someone from Pruitt's legal team made contact with the Department of the Navy about your service record this afternoon, trying to establish that your commendation was procedural, not substantive. They're going to argue that your military background is being inflated to prejudice the case against their client. Mara stopped walking. She read the message a second time. Pruitt's team had made contact with the Department of the Navy. They had found the commendation, which was a matter of service record, not classified, and they were going to use it. Not against her, but preemptively, as a way of getting ahead of whatever the commendation might mean to a jury, by framing it as bureaucratic rather than earned. She stood in the hallway and understood that the situation had, in the last 4 minutes, changed shape. Pruitt's team had a strategy. They had found a pressure point. They had decided to make the record the battleground, which meant they were more afraid of the record than they had let Webb know in that conference room. She typed back to Dosh, is there someone available to speak on the record about the specific circumstances of the commendation? Dosh's reply came in 40 seconds. 3 people. They've already volunteered. Mara stared at the message. 3 people who had been there. 3 people who had held the memory of what happened on the night that the commendation documented, who had said nothing about it publicly because there was no occasion that required them to speak, who were now, at the moment that an officer's defense team had decided to minimize her record, raising their hands. She was composing her reply when she heard the footsteps behind her rapid, coming from the direction of the conference room, and turned to find not Pruitt but Webb, moving fast, with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. Pruitt's lawyer just told me something, Webb said, stopping 2 feet from her. I think you need to know. Tell me. Pruitt says he has a witness. Someone who was in the South Corridor yesterday morning, not a courthouse employee, not recorded on the main security array, but someone who claims to have seen the initial contact differently than the footage shows. Webb's eyes were steady and uncomfortable. He won't name them until his formal hearing. But he's claiming the camera angle doesn't show everything. Mara looked at him. Who was in that corridor, Marcus? That's what I'm trying to. Who had access to the South Corridor yesterday before the 9 o'clock docket? The maintenance log shows 1 contractor pass before 7. The corridor is otherwise restricted. He paused. The 2 officers Pruitt spoke to Farwell and Obrist, neither of them were in that corridor during the incident window. We've confirmed that. Then Pruitt is either lying about the witness, Mara said, or the witness is someone who was not supposed to be in that corridor and has not yet come forward because coming forward reveals that. Webb stared at her. Or, she said, there is no witness, and this is a delay tactic designed to create doubt before the formal hearing. What do you want me to do, he said. I want you to go back to that conference room and tell Pruitt's attorney that if this witness exists, naming them is in their client's interest and delay is not. She held his eyes. And then I want you to pull the maintenance log for the South Corridor from 0500 to 0900 yesterday and find out exactly who that contractor was and what they were doing there. Webb left. Mara turned back toward the stairwell and saw through the small window in the door, black SUV pulling into the courthouse's restricted lot, the one reserved for federal and judicial vehicles. 2 people getting out, both in uniform, Naval Reserve uniforms. She stood in the hallway very still and watched the 2 uniformed figures speak briefly to the security officer at the lot's pedestrian gate, produce credentials, and be admitted. They were moving toward the building's north entrance, the administrative access, the same way Mara had come in this morning. Her phone buzzed. Dosh, we have 2 people on site. They came voluntarily. They want to make statements in whatever forum is appropriate. They said to tell you, and I'm quoting directly, we knew where she was going when she went back in. Mara read it twice. She understood what it meant. It meant the two officers who had just walked through the north entrance had been in operational environments with her, had watched her go back into bad situations when the count didn't balance, had come on a Friday afternoon to a courthouse in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, to stand in a room and be part of the record. It was not theater. It was not strategy. It was the same impulse that had made Oleski send a message 14 months ago and keep a personal log on the chance that someone would eventually open the folder, the conviction that what actually happened should exist somewhere in verifiable form, that the truth of a thing should not be allowed to be smaller than the lie constructed around it. The stairwell door opened. Carl Steen appeared, slightly out of breath. There are 2 Navy people at the north desk, he said. I know, Mara said. They're asking for you specifically. I know that too. She pushed off the wall for the second time in 10 minutes. Tell them I'm on my way. She was halfway to the north entrance when the building alarm, not the fire alarm, the security alarm, a different tone, lower and more urgent, began to sound from the direction of the records room. Mara turned toward the alarm before it completed its second cycle. The records room was 40 feet behind her, back the way she had come, and the alarm tone was not the building's standard intrusion alert, it was the tamper alert, the one wired to the document preservation system. The one that triggered when someone attempted to access, remove, or physically interfere with files that had been placed under a legal hold. Mara knew the distinction because she had signed the order that established the hold parameters 18 months ago when the court had digitized its archiving system and the IT department had walked every judicial officer through the alert protocols. She reversed direction and covered the 40 feet at something close to a run. Carl was already there. He had arrived from the opposite direction and had his hand on the records room door, which was closed. A second security officer, younger, whose name Mara knew as Trent Bales, was on the radio, talking fast. Who's inside? Mara said. Door was closed when the alert fired, Carl said. The hold order covers the Pruitt-linked case files and the evidence reference logs. Someone triggered the physical document sensor. Is there another exit from that room? Service corridor in the back. Connects to the building's East Maintenance Hall. Mara looked at Bales. East Maintenance Hall, cover it. Now Bales moved. Carl opened the door. The records room was a long, narrow space lined on 3 walls with file shelving units and 2 workstation desks along the center. The overhead lights were fully on. A rolling file cart had been pulled away from shelf section C, the section that housed closed criminal case files, cross-referenced with the years covering Pruitt's documented service period. 3 accordion folders were on the cart. 2 of them were open. There was nobody in the room. Carl checked the service corridor door. It was unlocked, handle showing fresh fingerprints on the push plate smeared, which meant someone had moved through it fast, in a hurry. He pushed through and came back 30 seconds later. Gone. Bales is in the East Maintenance Hall, but they moved quickly enough they could have reached the exterior exit before he got there. Mara was looking at the cart. She had not touched it, and she was not going to touch it. Get Garland. Get him here physically, not on the phone. She scanned the room. And I need the workstation logs, what was accessed on these terminals in the last 30 minutes. The room had 2 security cameras, one covering the entrance, one covering the workstation area. The shelving alcove where the cart currently sat was in a blind spot that the original installation had been designed to address, and that a budget decision 2 years ago had deferred. Mara knew this because she had read the Facilities Committee report and had been told the camera expansion would be completed in the spring. It was October. She stood in the doorway of the records room and looked at the 3 open accordion folders on the cart and did the math in her head. Pruitt's team had known which files were relevant. They had known because Pruitt had accessed the case management system at 6:40 this morning and identified the case numbers. They had known which physical files corresponded to those numbers because the courthouse's archiving system cross-referenced digital and physical records, and that cross-reference was accessible to anyone with a case management login. Someone had come into the records room in the 10-minute window between Webb leaving the conference room and the alarm firing. Someone who moved fast, knew exactly what they were looking for, and had gotten to the service corridor before Carl opened the door. Trent Bales came back through the main entrance, slightly winded. East exterior door was propped open. Whoever it was is gone. I've called it in to the lot attendant, but... He shook his head. 3-minute head start minimum. Pull the lot camera footage, Mara said. Every camera that covers the east side of the building from 1400 today. Yes, ma'am. And no one touches that car. Garland arrived in 9 minutes, which was fast enough that Mara assumed he had already been in the building. He looked at the cart, looked at the accordion folders, and let out a controlled breath through his nose that communicated several things without saying any of them. "The folders that are open," he said. "Are they the ones from the case list?" "I don't know yet. I haven't touched them. I need to document this in sequence before anyone." "I know the process," she said. "That's why I haven't touched them." He looked at her. The particular look of someone recalibrating their estimate of a person upward, which she registered and did not comment on. He pulled on gloves, moved to the cart, and checked the tab labels on the open folders. He was quiet for a moment. "These are 2 of the 6 flagged cases," he said. "Pruitt's arrest files. Original documentation." He carefully lifted the edge of the top folder without disturbing its contents. "There's paperwork missing from this one. I can see the fastener holes where it was attached recent. The paper is fresh torn." Mara was very still. "Someone removed documents from an active IA hold," she said.
Yes.
"Which means they now have the originals of whatever was missing. And we have a file that is visibly incomplete," which she stopped. "Which is actually worse for Pruitt than if they'd left it alone," Garland said, finishing the thought. "Because now the chain of custody for the missing documents is broken, and the hole in the file is itself evidentiary. Can you determine what was in those positions?" "The digital scan of this file was completed during the archiving process. We have a complete image of everything that was in it, as of 18 months ago." He straightened. "Whatever is missing now will be apparent the moment we compare the physical file to the digital record. How long to get that comparison done?" "Tonight if I push it." "Push it." She left him to his work and walked back into the hallway, where Carl was waiting with the expression of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "What?" she said. "The 2 Navy people. They're still at the north desk. I told them you'd been delayed. One of them, the taller one, she said to tell you that they're not in a hurry." He paused. "She also said, we've waited in worse places." Mara looked at him. Something shifted briefly in her face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that Carl filed it away. "Take me to them," she said. Lieutenant Commander Riva Antis and Chief Petty Officer Wes Borum had both served in the same operational element as Mara during the period that the commendation documented. Antis was 38, precise and economical in her movements, with the bearing of someone who has been in command long enough that it has stopped feeling like something she's performing. Borum was 42, heavier than he'd been in service, but with the same stillness that Mara remembered, the kind that comes from having been in situations where stillness was the difference between an outcome and its alternative. They met in a small conference room on the 2nd floor that Davy had arranged, and for about 4 minutes the conversation was the specific and somewhat stilted catching up of people who shared an important history and were encountering each other in an unexpected context. Antis asked about the face. Mara said it was fine. Borum said something briefly under his breath that Mara chose not to ask him to repeat. Then Antis set a folder on the table. "This is a voluntary statement," she said. "Both of ours, documenting our first-hand knowledge of the circumstances surrounding your commendation, the operational details that are cleared for disclosure, the specific conduct that the commendation recognizes, and our direct observations of your performance during the Tanner Creek evacuation sequence." Mara looked at the folder without opening it. "Dosh," said Pruitt's team, is characterizing the commendation as procedural. "We know." Antis's voice was flat and specific. "It wasn't procedural. You brought 3 people out of a situation that had been assessed as non-survivable, and you did it with 2 minutes of useful daylight left and a secondary threat that hadn't been cleared." She paused. "I was there. Wes was there. The commendation's language is careful because certain elements are restricted, but what it describes is accurate, and we are willing to say so, on the record, in whatever forum is appropriate." Borum said, "Nobody made us come here. We came because someone needs to know who they're dealing with when they deal with you." Mara sat with that for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. "This case is expanding. What started as a misconduct complaint against one officer now involves potentially falsified evidence in multiple convictions, a tampered records room, and a defense strategy that is actively trying to reshape the narrative before the formal hearing." She looked at both of them. "If you give those statements, you may be called to testify, not about operational details, about character and professional capacity. It may be public, we know," Antis said. "I don't want you here for me," Mara said. "I want to be clear about that." "We're not here for you," Borum said. "We're here because what happened in that corridor is the kind of thing that needs a complete record, and the record isn't complete without us." Mara opened the folder. The workstation access logs from the records room came back at 4:55. The terminal closest to the shelving alcove had been accessed at 14:17 using login credentials belonging to Arlene Muir, the clerk's assistant whom Carl had seen Pruitt speaking to in the corridor earlier that afternoon. Arlene Muir, when Garland sat down with her at 5:20 in a conference room with a union representative present at her own request, was visibly shaken and visibly angry, which were two different things that people sometimes confused for each other. She had not, she said, given anyone her login credentials. She had not, she said, been aware that her credentials had been used. She had, she confirmed, spoken with Pruitt in the corridor at approximately 2:20, during which he had asked her a question about how to submit a retroactive case file access request, which had required her to look up the procedure on her workstation while he stood beside her, while she had been looking at the screen. Garland documented this carefully, and his expression during the documentation was the expression of a man who has found the last piece of a mechanism and can now see exactly how it was designed to work. Pruitt had stood beside Muir's workstation while she looked up a procedure. He had watched her enter her credentials. He had retained them. He had used them 43 minutes later to access the records room terminal and identify the exact physical location of the files he needed. And then someone, not Pruitt, because Pruitt had been in the conference room with Webb from 2:30 onward, which was documented and witnessed, had gone to the records room and removed the pages. Someone Pruitt had arranged in advance, who had not known, when they pulled those pages and moved through the service corridor, that the physical document tamper alert would fire. Because the tamper alert was a feature of the preservation hold, and the hold had been placed by Garland's office the previous evening, after Pruitt had already been suspended, after his access should have been cut, and the existence of the hold had not been made public. It was, Garland said to Wolt at 5:45, in a corridor conversation that both of them were conscious of keeping brief, the kind of mistake you make when you think you know more than you do. Wolt said, "We need to identify who was in that service corridor. The lot cameras are being reviewed. We'll have something by tonight. And Muir cooperative, not implicated." He paused. "She's upset. She keeps saying she should have noticed him looking. She was looking up a procedure for someone who asked her a question," Wolt said. "That's not negligence. That's someone exploiting basic workplace courtesy. I know, I told her that." He didn't say whether it had helped. It probably hadn't yet. These things take time to feel true. At 6:10, Felicity Crane from the AG's office called Mara directly. "We've completed the file comparison on the 2 open folders," she said. 8 pages missing from the first file, 11 from the second. We have the complete digital scan for both. The missing pages include, in the first file, the original evidence intake form with Pruitt's handwritten notation, which in the digital scan shows a timestamp that conflicts with the chain of custody log, and in the second file, a supplemental arrest report that was never entered into the official case record. Mara said, "Was the supplemental report visible in the case record, accessible to the defense attorneys in those cases?" A pause. "No, so the defense attorneys in both cases litigated without access to a supplemental report that existed and was withheld. That's what the comparison shows, Crane." Mara kept her voice even. "Those convictions need to be reviewed for Brady violations. Both of them." "We're already there," Crane said. "The review unit is filing a motion in Peel's case, first thing Monday morning. The second case, the defendant served her sentence. She's been out for 2 years. We're going to need to contact her. The civil implications are separate and significant." "Her name?" "Dorinda Quast. She's in Allegheny County now, working at a warehouse distribution center." A pause that had weight. "She was 26 when she was convicted. She lost her apartment during the incarceration, lost custody of her daughter during proceedings, and has a conviction record that has affected her employment for 2 years since release." Mara was quiet for a long time. Not because she didn't have words, but because the words that were forming were not the ones she needed to be saying into a legal proceeding call. "Make sure she has counsel," she said finally. "If she doesn't have someone already, make sure the State Bar's pro bono coordinator knows her situation. We'll take care of it today, Crane. Not Monday." A brief pause. "Today." The lot camera footage came back at 7:30 and showed exactly what Garland had expected and somewhat more than he had hoped for. A figure in a gray hoodie had exited the courthouse's east exterior door at 14:32, moved across the restricted lot at a pace that was controlled enough not to attract attention but fast enough to cover ground, and gotten into a vehicle, a silver sedan, partial plate visible, that had been parked in the adjacent public lot since 1:45. The partial plate was enough. The vehicle was registered to a man named Cord Levy, 31 years old, currently employed as a contractor with the city's Facilities Management Division. He had a prior arrest, no conviction from 4 years ago, on a charge that had been filed by a detective working out of Hartwell Station. The detective was no longer with the department. The charge had been dropped. The arresting officer listed as secondary on the incident report was Officer Dale Pruitt. Garland shared this with Wolt at 7:48, and they sat with it for a moment in the particular way of investigators who have watched a picture resolve from noise into signal. Levy owes him something, Wolt said. Or Pruitt has something on him, Garland said. The arrest with no conviction if Pruitt had the discretion to determine how that charge was pursued and chose not to pursue it. Then Levy spent 4 years knowing Pruitt could change his mind. Yeah. They sent Levy's information to the state police at 7:52 because the situation had expanded beyond the courthouse and beyond the county, and because the state police had resources for the next step that neither of them had in their current capacity. At 8:19, Cord Levy was located at a bar in the Trennick neighborhood of Dunmore and was asked by 2 state troopers in plainclothes to come with them. He did not come willingly, but he came, which is most of what that means in practice, and by 9 o'clock he was in a room with Wolt and a state police investigator named Huang, looking at the lot camera footage on a laptop screen, and his attorney reached by phone, arrived in 40 minutes, was already in the hallway calculating. Levy's attorney negotiated for 3 hours. What Levy provided, in exchange for a consideration that would take the DA's office until the following week to formalize, was a statement describing a conversation with Pruitt that had occurred the previous evening, in which Pruitt had explained which files he needed, described their physical location using information from the case management system he had accessed that morning, and told Levy that all he needed to do was go in, find them, pull the specific pages, and get out through the service corridor. He had given Levy a copied key to the service corridor access. He had told Levy the timing. He had not told Levy about the tamper hold, because he hadn't known about it, which meant that the plan, Pruitt's plan, specifically designed and specifically executed, had failed not because of anything dramatic, but because a legal hold that Garland had placed at 8:15 Thursday evening, in routine response to an expanded investigation, had a physical document censor that no one involved in the plan had factored in. A routine hold, a standard feature, a 3-line order that Garland had processed between 2 other items on his late Thursday task list and had thought nothing further about. Mara learned all of this from Garland directly, in a phone call at 10:45 at night, and she sat in the same chair at her kitchen table, where she had taken Yaris's call the previous evening and listened to the full account without interrupting. When Garland finished, she said, "Is Pruitt in custody?" "Not yet. We're building to that. The state police are coordinating with the DA. Levy's statement gives us the evidence tampering and the obstruction, and the AG's office is adding the Brady violations and the falsified reports from the original cases. Webb has been informed." He's a pause. He's not defending it. I'll say that. "What about Farwell and Obrist? The 2 officers he talked to yesterday. Under review. We don't have anything implicating them in the tampering, but the conversation Pruitt had with them Thursday morning, what he told them about the incident, how he framed it, that's going to be part of the broader record. And Swick, the union rep, not implicated in the tampering. He may have known Pruitt was strategizing around the evidence that's harder to establish. The unions already made a statement distancing themselves from the records room incident. Mara absorbed this. "When are you bringing him in?" "Tomorrow morning. Early." She looked at the window. The kitchen was the same, the night outside the same flat October dark, but something had changed in its quality, the particular change that happens when a thing that has been moving fast suddenly shows you its full shape, and the shape is larger than you thought, and more people are in it than you thought. And the work of getting to this point was done by people most of whom will never be in a news story about it. Oleski and his 14 months of silence and his careful personal log, Garland processing a routine hold at 8:15 on a Thursday night, Cord Levy's attorney calculating in a hallway, Arlene Muir looking up a procedure and not knowing she was being watched. "Garland," she said. "Yeah, the woman, Dorinda Quast. Did someone make contact today?" A brief pause that told her the answer before he said it. "The pro bono coordinator reached out. She has someone." Another pause. "She quassed when they called. She asked if it was a mistake." "The coordinator. She asked if someone had called the wrong number." Mara was quiet. She'd been told the case was solid, Garland said. "At trial. She went in thinking there was no way a jury would—" He stopped. "It's a long time to carry something like that." "Yes," Mara said. It is. She ended the call and sat without moving for a while. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, on the notepad she kept beside her at the kitchen table, 3 things. Peel. Quast. The others we haven't found yet. Not as a task list, she had the task list. As a reminder of the actual shape of what this was. Under all the procedure and documentation and evidentiary framework. Actual people, actual time, actual damage that had been building since long before a woman in Navy scrubs had rounded a corner in a courthouse hallway, and a man had looked at her and decided in the space of a glance that she could be grabbed. She set the pen down. Her phone buzzed. A message from Antis. Statements have been formally filed with IA and the AG's office. Borum sends regards. Will be available for testimony if it comes to that. Get some sleep. Mara looked at the message for a moment. She had not, in 2 days, spent much time on the specific quality of what it meant that people kept showing up Yaris calling at night. Antis and Borum getting in a car and driving to Dunmore on a Friday. Oleski keeping a log for 14 months on the chance that someone would eventually ask. She had kept moving because moving was what the situation required, and she was good at moving, and she had trained herself over years in environments where stopping meant something different and worse than it means in a courthouse hallway, not to register the weight of things until there was a moment to do it. This was a moment. She sat in her kitchen at 10:53 on a Friday night and let herself feel, briefly and completely, the specific weight of all of it the morning, the corridor, the annex, the expanding investigation, Quast's voice on a phone asking if someone had called the wrong number. Then she replied to Antis, "Thank you, both of you." She set the phone on the table. She was reaching for the notepad again. There were still things to review before morning, when the phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it out of the specific habit of someone who has learned that calls at this hour are either wrong numbers or things that can't wait. It was neither, Judge Odum. A man's voice measured slightly formal. "My name is Philip Sorrento. I'm an attorney with the State Public Defender's Office. I apologize for the hour." A pause. "I'm calling about a client who has been following the news coverage of the current situation involving Officer Pruitt. My client has information that is directly relevant to the investigation." Another pause, and this one had a specific quality. The quality of someone choosing their next words carefully, because the words matter. "My client is a former Dunmore City police officer who left the department in 2019 under circumstances that were characterized as voluntary retirement. He would like to correct that characterization. And he would like to tell you what he saw Dale Pruitt do to a 17-year-old in the back of a patrol car in the fall of 2018, what he saw, what he reported, and what happened to the report." Mara's hand tightened on the phone. "Tell your client," she said, "that I will have someone from the AG's office call him first thing tomorrow morning." "He anticipated that," Sorrento said. "He also asked me to tell you something directly. He said, 'Tell her I tried to stop it. I just didn't know how until now.'" The kitchen was very quiet. Mara said, "What is your client's name?" "His name is Raymond Volk. He was Pruitt's partner for 3 years." A pause. "And he has kept a copy of the original incident report, the one that was supposed to be destroyed for 7 years in a fireproof box in his garage, because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away, even when he was told to." Raymond Volk's statement ran to 41 pages. He had written it himself, longhand, over the course of a single night in the spring of 2022, not because anyone had asked for it, but because he had been unable to sleep, and had decided, at 2 in the morning, with his coffee going cold on the desk, that if he was going to carry the thing he might as well carry a version of it that existed somewhere outside his own head. He had sealed it in an envelope, put it in the fireproof box with the incident report copy, and had not opened it again until his attorney called him Friday night and told him that the time had arrived. His attorney, Philip Sorrento, delivered the box to the AG's office at 8:15 Saturday morning. Felicity Crane signed for it personally. She read the handwritten statement in the conference room, while Garland sat across from her, and the state investigator named Huang stood by the window, and when she finished, she set it down and looked at neither of them for a moment. "He named 4 incidents," she said, in detail. "Dates, locations, the names of the individuals involved." "All minors?" Huang asked. 3 minors. 1 adult, a woman who had been arrested on a misdemeanor charge, processed and released, and then received a visit from Pruitt in an unofficial capacity 3 days later that Volk describes in his statement as coercive and threatening. She straightened the pages. Volk says he reported 2 of the 4 incidents through departmental channels in 2018 and 2019. He has documentation of both reports. He says the first was closed without investigation, and the second resulted in a meeting with a shift commander who told him that raising unfounded allegations against a senior colleague was a form of insubordination. Garland was quiet for a moment. Who was the shift commander? Crane checked the statement. A lieutenant named Brecht. He retired in 2021. We're going to need to find Brecht. We're already looking. She closed the folder. The incident report, Volk kept the copy from the 2018 case. It has Pruitt's signature on the bottom, and it's different from the version in the departmental archive. Garland looked up. The archived version has a different disposition code, Crane said. The one Volk kept is coded as an open referral, meaning it should have been forwarded to a specialized unit for follow-up. The archived version is coded as resolved on scene. She paused. Someone changed the code after the report was filed. We can establish that because the archived version was processed through the system 12 days after the incident, which is outside the standard filing window, and the filing notation has an officer ID number that doesn't match Pruitt's. Whose number is it? We're running it. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room where people are holding the full weight of what they have just understood. We're past misconduct, Huang said finally. This is criminal. It was always criminal, Crane said. We're just now able to prove it. Dale Pruitt was arrested at 9:47 Saturday morning at his residence, a rental house in the Colburn Hill neighborhood of Dunmore, by 2 state police detectives and a federal marshal whose presence indicated that at least one of the charges being pursued had crossed a jurisdictional threshold that elevated the matter beyond state proceedings. He did not come out of the house immediately. There was a period of approximately 11 minutes during which Swick, his union rep, who had been called at 9:15 and had arrived at 9:31, looking like a man who had not slept and had received news he had been hoping not to receive, spoke to him through the front door. Then the door opened and Pruitt came out in jeans and a gray sweatshirt, his face carrying the particular deflation of a man who had spent the previous 48 hours constructing scenarios in which that did not happen and had now run out of scenarios. The charges were read to him at the vehicle. Garland had provided Crane with the full compiled charge list, which included aggravated assault on a judicial officer, obstruction of justice through evidence tampering, falsification of official records across multiple cases, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and 2 counts related to the incidents documented in Volk's statement that the federal marshal's presence was there to cover. Pruitt said nothing when the charges were read. His jaw worked once, the way it had in the courthouse on Thursday, and then he got into the vehicle, and Swick stood on the curb watching it pull away with the look of a man calculating the precise distance between his client's situation and his own. The news of the arrest was on the Dunmore Register's website by 10:20. By noon, it had reached the state wire services. By mid-afternoon, it was on the regional television broadcasts, and the coverage was by that point detailed enough that several journalists had correctly identified the connection between the Thursday morning incident and the expanded investigation, and were beginning to report on the case structure with the specific interest of people who understood they were looking at something larger than a single officer. Mara learned about the arrest from Garland's text at 9:51. She was at her kitchen table, where she had been since 7, working through the document she hadn't finished the night before. She read the text twice, set the phone down, and finished the paragraph she was reading before she allowed herself to stop. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and breathed. It was not triumph, it was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than either of those, the specific and difficult feeling of a thing that should not have needed to happen, having happened anyway, after the damage that made it necessary had already been done. Peel was still in a correctional facility pending Monday's motion. Quast was in Allegheny County with a conviction on her record and 2 years of lost ground, and a daughter she had not had custody of. The 17-year-old from Volk's statement, whoever they were, wherever they were now, had been 17 in 2018 and was not 17 anymore, and had carried something for 6 years that nobody had stopped. The arrest was not the end of those things. It was the beginning of the process of accounting for them, which was different and slower and more complicated and less satisfying in the immediate moment than the cleaner version of justice that exists in stories where the right person gets taken away in handcuffs and everything resolves into legible relief. Mara knew this. She had been a lawyer long enough to know it, and a judge long enough to have sat with the gap between procedural resolution and actual repair many times, in many cases, with many people who had come to the courthouse expecting one thing and left with the other. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The motion in Torrin Peel's case was filed at 9:03 Monday morning by an assistant from the AG's review unit, and the judge assigned to it not Mara, whose connection to the investigation required recusal from related proceedings, but a circuit court judge named Alvarado, who had been brought in specifically for this purpose, granted an emergency hearing for that afternoon. Peel's public defender, a woman named Sasha Rennick, who had taken the case as an assignment and had stayed on it voluntarily after the initial contact from the pro bono coordinator, sat across the table from Peel in the facility's attorney meeting room at 11 that morning and explained what was happening as clearly as she could, which was clearly enough that Peel understood the broad shape of it, even through the specific and numbing disorientation of being told that the system that had put you somewhere was now acknowledging it may have been wrong. He asked one question. He asked, "Is it real?" Rennick said yes. He didn't say anything else for a while. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Who found it?" And Rennick told him the investigation, the expanded review, Volk's statement, the file comparison, the tamper alert that had fired because of a routine preservation hold placed by an investigator on a Thursday evening. The whole thing, the way it connected, the sequence of it. Peel listened. Then he said a fire alarm. "A document tamper alert," Rennick said. "It's different from a fire alarm, but basically someone tried to steal something and the system caught it." So, yes, he was quiet again. "And the judge, the one Pruitt hit, she's the one she initiated the investigation. She placed the preservation hold, directed the evidence documentation, coordinated with the AG's office." Rennick paused. "She's recused from your proceedings, so she won't be in the room today. But yes." Peel looked at his hands. "She doesn't know me." "No." She stopped. "Okay," he said finally, in the tone of someone who has decided to believe something and needs as a moment to settle into the belief.
"Okay."
The hearing that afternoon lasted 90 minutes. Judge Alvarado reviewed the materials, heard from the AG's review unit, heard from Rennick, and issued a ruling that vacated Peel's conviction pending a full evidentiary review. Peel was released from the facility at 4:47 that afternoon, walked out through a set of double doors into an October parking lot, and stood in the cold air for a moment before his mother, who had driven 2 hours, reached him. Rennick, standing near her car, watched this happen and found that she was not able to be professional about it in the precise way that professional required, so she stood by her car and gave them the moment, and did not look directly at them for a while. The proceedings against Pruitt moved with a speed that surprised people who didn't know the mechanism behind it, and did not surprise people who did. When an investigation has been built carefully, when the documentation is complete, when the witnesses have come forward voluntarily, when the physical evidence exists in multiple forms and has been preserved by multiple parties, the legal process that follows, it does not need to construct its case so much as assemble what has already been built. Volk's testimony given in a formal deposition over 2 days was specific, consistent, and corroborated by the incident report he had kept for 7 years. The 4 incidents he described were investigated independently, and 3 of the 4 produced corroborating evidence, other witnesses, medical records, a supplemental document found in a file from a related case that nobody had flagged at the time because nobody had been looking for it. The officer ID number on the altered disposition code in Pruitt's 2018 case resolved to a patrol officer named Garrett Finch, who had been transferred to administrative duties in 2020 and was no longer with the department. Finch, when contacted, declined to comment through his attorney. His attorney then contacted the AG's office the following day to discuss a cooperation arrangement, which Crane assessed and declined on grounds that the available evidence against Finch's client was sufficient without cooperation, and that cooperation at this stage was self-serving rather than substantive. Finch was subsequently charged with falsification of official records. Lieutenant Brecht, the shift commander who had told Volk that raising allegations against a senior colleague was insubordination, was located in retirement in Florida. He was 71, had significant health issues, and declined to travel voluntarily. A deposition was arranged remotely. He did not perform well in the deposition, in the specific sense that people do not perform well when the questions are specific and documented, and the answers they have available to them are limited by their own prior actions. He was ultimately not charged, a decision that Crane made on evidentiary grounds, and that Mara, when informed of it, accepted without comment, because evidentiary grounds are evidentiary grounds, and her personal feelings about men who tell junior officers to sit down and stop noticing things were not the relevant standard. Farwell and Obrist, the 2 officers Pruitt had spoken to Thursday morning, were found to have no prior knowledge of the evidence tampering and to have passed along Pruitt's framing of events without full understanding of its significance. Both received formal reprimands for their conduct in the subsequent hours, specifically for failing to report the conversation to a supervisor. Both were required to complete ethics training. Neither was satisfied with this outcome, and several of their colleagues were not satisfied with it either, and the Hartwell Station had a difficult few months in which the specific discomfort of institutional reckoning expressed itself in the way it usually does, which is unevenly and with a great deal of noise. Cord Levy cooperated fully in exchange for a plea on the evidence tampering charge. He received a suspended sentence and 2 years of supervised probation. He lost the facilities management contract. He did not, as far as anyone could document, have any further contact with Pruitt or Pruitt's remaining associates. The formal proceedings against Pruitt took 11 months from arrest to sentencing. This is not fast by the standard of stories where justice arrives in a clean arc, but it is fast by the standard of actual proceedings, where complexity compounds and attorneys file motions and continuances happen for reasons that are sometimes strategic and sometimes simply logistical, and the people most affected wait with the particular patience. That is not peace, but is the only option available. Pruitt pleaded not guilty at arraignment. His attorney Swick had been replaced by a private defense attorney named Kessler, who was expensive and experienced and who did the best available work with what was available to work with, filed 7 pretrial motions, of which 3 were partially granted and 4 were denied. The trial lasted 16 days. Mara did not attend the trial. This was appropriate, given her role in the investigation, and she maintained the distance with the discipline she had maintained through every other aspect of the proceedings, not because the distance was easy, but because the integrity of the process required it, and the process was the thing that mattered. She knew this. She had always known it. Knowing it didn't make the waiting feel better, but it made it feel necessary, which is a different thing and sometimes more useful. She was in her chambers on a Wednesday in September, reviewing motions from a family court case that had been on her docket for 3 months when Garland called. Guilty, he said. All counts. She set down the motion. All of them. Everyone. The jury was out for 9 hours. A pause. The 2 federal counts, the jury came back on those last. They were apparently the longest deliberation. But they came back. She looked at the wall above her desk. The blank institutional beige. The photograph on the corner. Thank you, Garland, she said. You know this didn't happen because of any one person, he said. I need to say that. I know. Oleski's testimony was... He stopped. The jury was watching him very carefully. You could see it. He kept the log for 14 months, she said. People recognize what that costs. Yeah. A pause. Volk, too. When he described the 2018 incident, what he witnessed, what he reported, and what happened to the report, there were 2 jurors who couldn't look at Pruitt while he was talking. Mara was quiet. It's done, Garland said. The sentencing is in 6 weeks, but it's done. She thanked him again and ended the call and sat in the quiet of her chambers for a while. And this time she did not give herself 30 seconds or 4 minutes or any specific allocation. She sat until she was ready to stand, and then she stood. Dale Pruitt was sentenced on a Thursday morning in late October, almost exactly 1 year after the morning that had started it. He received 14 years on the federal counts, with additional concurrent state sentences on the falsification and obstruction charges, and a permanent prohibition from holding any law enforcement position, any position of public trust, or any role involving authority over individuals in custody. His pension was revoked. His certification was permanently rescinded. Judge Alvarado delivered the sentence with the specific language of someone who had considered it carefully and wanted the record to reflect that consideration. He described the pattern of conduct, not the single incident, not the morning in the corridor, but the 9 years of documented misconduct, the altered records, the suppressed reports, the people who had been in Pruitt's professional orbit and had been made smaller by it through deliberate institutional force. He used the word deliberate 3 times. This was not accidental. Pruitt stood for the sentencing without visible expression. He had been like that through much of the trial, controlled in a way that read, depending on who was watching, as either composure or emptiness. His attorney Kessler had advised the controlled affect correctly, because the alternative in a trial with this evidentiary record would have been worse. But sitting in the courtroom that morning, watching through the live feed that the court was streaming for press access, Brant Oleski, who had driven 3 hours to sit in the overflow room of the courthouse with a cup of bad coffee and watch this on a monitor thought that what he was actually seeing was a man who had run out of the specific fuel that had powered him for 15 years and had not yet discovered what was underneath. Oleski sat with that for a moment. Then he threw away the coffee because it was genuinely bad, and he drove home. Dorinda Quast's civil case was settled 14 months after Pruitt's arrest. The terms were not public, but they were described by her attorney as addressing the full scope of the harm, which is the careful legal language for an amount that recognized the specific texture of what 2 years of a wrongful conviction record does to a person's actual life, the job applications that don't proceed, the apartment applications that don't proceed, the child custody modification that didn't proceed because of the conviction, and the particular ongoing cost of carrying something into every room you enter. Quast used part of the settlement to retain a family law attorney. The custody modification was refiled. It is still in process, which is what the family court system does to everything. And her attorney is good, and the outcome is not guaranteed. But it is possible in a way it was not before, and possible matters. She was asked by a local journalist who covered the story for the state public radio affiliate whether she felt vindicated. She thought about the question for a moment. Vindicated implies it was ever close, she said. What I feel is like I lost 2 years and now someone finally said out loud that I lost them. She paused. That's not the same as getting them back. The journalist included this in the story without editing it, which was the right decision. Torrin Peel's charges were formally dismissed with prejudice 4 months after his release. The AG's office issued a written acknowledgement of the evidentiary failures in his case, which was not an apology. Government offices do not apologize in that clean way. They acknowledge and issue statements, but which was specific enough in its description of what had happened that it functioned as one for the people who read it carefully. Peel had, in the months since his release, been working at a logistics company through a re-entry employment program. He was not, he said, particularly interested in being a story. He was interested in getting his driver's license reinstated, which required navigating 3 separate bureaucratic processes that were each slightly easier now than they had been with a conviction on his record, but were still processes. He sent a letter to the court's administrative office addressed generally, not to any specific individual, that said he was grateful that someone had checked the count and found it didn't balance, that he knew that the person who had done that hadn't done it for him specifically, hadn't known his name, hadn't been thinking about him when they went back through the door, that he thought that was actually more meaningful, not less. The letter was received by Davy Ingram, who read it, understood who it was meant for, and placed it on Mara's desk without comment. Mara read it standing up between hearings, still in her robe. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her robe and went back into the courtroom. The Hartwell County Court of Common Pleas adopted a revised protocol for security access credentials in February, requiring visible judicial identification to be cross-checked against the court's active personnel roster at every restricted access point. The Facilities Committee approved and funded the camera expansion to cover the records room shelving alcoves in the same month, which was 4 months after the budgetary deferral that had left the blind spot in place. The police oversight office that had received Oleski's email and filed it without action was subject to a state audit in the spring. The audit found 3 additional complaints filed in the preceding 5 years that had not been acted upon, none as significant as Oleski's, but none that were nothing either. The oversight office's director resigned before the audit concluded. A new director was appointed with a specific mandate from the county executive that included response time requirements and an annual public reporting obligation. Lieutenant Webb gave an interview to a regional newspaper in which he said, among other things, that the department had failed the people it was supposed to serve, that the failure had not been one person, but a system that had made looking away easier than looking, and that he did not know yet whether the changes being made would be sufficient, but that the alternative to attempting them was not acceptable. It was a more honest interview than most institutional leaders give after situations like this, which is not the same as being honest enough, but it was what it was. Raymond Volk, who had kept the incident for 7 years in a fireproof box in his garage, was 53 years old. He had left the department in 2019, stating health reasons, which was true in the specific sense that continuing to be in the department had become a health issue for him. He had worked since then in building maintenance. He was not a complicated man, he said so himself, to Sorrento, to the investigators, to anyone who asked him why he had kept the report. He said he had kept it because he had not been sure what to do with it, but he had known you could not throw away a true thing just because holding on to it was inconvenient. He was not seeking recognition for this. He specifically declined several requests from journalists who wanted to profile him. He said he would prefer that people talked about the people in the cases rather than about him. People talked about him anyway, because that is what people do with someone who kept a document in a box for 7 years in the principle. That true things should not be thrown away. And because that principle is not as common as it should be, and people recognize it when they see it. Mara returned to her courtroom the Monday after sentencing. She had taken 3 days, not vacation, not leave. Just 3 days in which she processed what there was to process and got her docket in order, and called her sister in Harrisburg, who had been following the news coverage and was worried in the specific way that sisters worry, which is not about the visible thing, but about what the visible thing is covering. Mara told her she was fine. Her sister said she sounded tired. Mara said that was different from not fine. Her sister said it wasn't that different. They argued about this briefly and comfortably, and ended the call with plans for the following weekend. On Monday, she came in through the parking structure, as she always did, and took the administrative access entrance and walked the corridor past the records room, and the stairwell, and the junction where the south corridor split toward the restricted hallway, and she did not stop at any of these points, because they were a corridor and a stairwell and a junction, and she had work. Carl Steen was at the security desk and said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." He didn't ask about her face, because the bruise had been gone for 11 months, and he didn't say anything about the sentencing, because it had been in the news, and she obviously knew. She went to chambers. She put on her robe. She reviewed the morning's docket, which included a sentencing hearing, a motion to suppress in a drug case, and a custody modification that had been continued twice and needed to move. Davy knocked at 8:55 and said the courtroom was ready. "Thank you, Davy," she said. "You good?" She looked at him. Davy Ingram had been her clerk for 2 years. He was 28, efficient, occasionally over-caffeinated, and had, over the course of the past year, grown into the work in ways that had nothing to do with the procedural aspects of clerking, and everything to do with what it meant to do the procedural aspects correctly when the stakes were real. "I'm good," she said. He nodded. He believed her, which meant she had said it with the right calibration. She walked out of chambers and down the hallway toward courtroom 4, and the bailiff at the door saw her coming and turned to open it. And as Mara stepped through into the courtroom's particular quality of anticipatory silence, attorneys at their tables, parties in their seats, the low ambient tension of people waiting for the proceeding to begin, she felt the thing she always felt when she entered a courtroom, which was not power in the way people imagined power, but responsibility, in the way people rarely imagined responsibility. Specific, weighted, belonging to something larger than herself that required her to be exactly and precisely who she was. The bailiff said, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Mara Odum." The room rose, not because of the year that had just happened, not because of what the news had covered, or the commendation, or what Antis and Borum had said on the record, or what the sentencing had resolved. They didn't know most of that. The people in this room, a defendant in a drug case who was scared, an attorney who had prepared carefully, a couple in a custody dispute who had both, in different ways, already lost more than they wanted to. They rose because she was the judge, and the proceeding was about to begin. And she stood at the front of the courtroom and looked at the people who had come there, for whatever complicated and difficult reason, had brought them to a courthouse on a Monday in October, and she thought about what it meant that the system these people were placing some portion of their trust in had recently demonstrated, in quite specific terms, that it could fail them, and that it could also, when the right people refused to look away, account for that failure. Not redeem it, not erase it, account for it. Begin the slow and imperfect work of repair. That was what she had. That was what the work was. Not the clean arc, not the moment where everything resolves into legible relief, but the ongoing and specific responsibility of showing up in the room and being exactly who you were, without apology, without diminishment, without allowing the people who had looked at you and seen something smaller than what you were to finish that sentence for you. She sat down. "Be seated," the bailiff said. The room settled. Mara opened the first file, found her place, and began. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need the room to know what it's cost. It doesn't require the moment of recognition to already have existed. It operates in the absence of recognition, carries itself through the hallways where no one knows yet, through the moments of being grabbed and reduced and told to stand differently than it stands. It keeps the count. It goes back through the door when the count doesn't balance. It puts documents in fireproof boxes and sends emails into silence on the chance that someone will eventually open the folder. It is not extraordinary. That is precisely the point. It is the ordinary decision, made again and again, to be accurate about what is true, and to refuse to cooperate with the version of things that asks you to be smaller. Mara Odum had been making that decision for 36 years. She would make it tomorrow. She would make it on the days when it cost nothing, and on the days when it cost considerably more. And the bruise would fade, it had faded, and the proceeding would end, it had ended, and she would still be in the room exactly herself, doing exactly the work. The first file was a sentencing hearing for a 22-year-old who had made a serious mistake and was scared and was looking at her from across the courtroom with the specific expression of someone who needed the system to see them as a person rather than a category. She saw him. She always saw them. That was the job. That had always been the job. From the first moment she had decided that the work of making things accurate and fair and accountable was the work she was built for. Before the deployment and the commendation and the law degree and the bench, before any of the things that had become the record before the record existed, when it was just her, paying attention, refusing to cooperate with imprecision. Judge Mara Odum looked at the young man across the courtroom, found her place in the file, and gave him her full and complete attention. It was the least he deserved. It was the most she knew how to give. It was enough.